She faced 17 rejections for her body. Then a human took her hand and said, "You're mine." Zara's fingers trembled as she counted the rejection notices scattered across her small kitchen table. 17. Each one bore the same clinical language, the same polite dismissal wrapped in bureaucratic terms that barely concealed the disgust beneath. Physical incompatibility with species requirements. Aesthetic standards not met. Biological variance outside acceptable parameters. She had been born different on Kepler 442b, her homeworld, where uniformity was prized above all else. Her skin bore intricate patterns of bioluminescent scales that shifted from deep emerald to silver blue, depending on her emotions. A genetic mutation that occurred in less than 1% of her species. What should have been considered beautiful was instead seen as aberrant, marking her as unsuitable for the arranged partnerships that governed their society. The 17th rejection had arrived that morning from the Galactic Compatibility Council. It was her final appeal, her last hope of finding acceptance within the structured systems that governed interspecies relationships. The words blurred as tears gathered in her eyes. Subject exhibits excessive deviation from established norms. Recommendation: remain unpaired. Zara's apartment overlooked the bustling marketplace of New Geneva, Earth's primary spaceport city, where hundreds of species mingled in relative harmony. She watched couples of various origins walking hand in hand below, Andromedan crystals, beings with their geometric partners, graceful Arcturians with their flowing forms, even some of her own kind, paired with others who fit their society's narrow definition of acceptable. Each sight was a reminder of what she had been denied. Her reflection in the window showed her the truth others couldn't see past. Yes, her scales were unusual, but her eyes held depths of compassion forged by years of rejection. Her hands, though, different in texture, were gentle and skilled. She worked as a xenobiologist, studying and preserving endangered species from across the galaxy. Her heart, though scarred, still held hope that somewhere in the vast universe, someone might look beyond the surface. The communication device on her table chimed, displaying a message from her supervisor at the research institute. Tomorrow, she would begin a new project studying Earth's recovery ecosystems in the Amazon basin. For 6 months, she would work alongside a human research team, far from the sterile corridors of the spaceport, where judgment followed her like a shadow. Zara pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, watching her bioluminescent patterns pulse with a soft, melancholy blue. Perhaps it was time to stop seeking acceptance from systems that would never see her worth. Perhaps it was time to lose herself in work, in the beauty of life forms that didn't judge based on appearance, but simply existed in their magnificent diversity. As night fell over New Geneva, Zara made a decision. She would take this assignment not as an escape, but as a chance to remember who she was beyond the rejections. She was a scientist, a protector of life, a being with her own intrinsic value, regardless of whether 17 councils recognized it or not. She packed her research equipment with careful precision, each instrument a tool that had helped her understand the intricate beauty of biological diversity. Tomorrow, she would enter a world where her difference might finally be seen not as a flaw, but as part of the magnificent tapestry of life itself. In the Amazon, among species that had evolved in countless unique ways, perhaps she would remember that variation was not aberration. It was evolution's greatest gift. The rejection notices remained on her table as she prepared for bed, but for the first time in months, they didn't feel like verdicts. They felt like outdated documents from a world too small to contain her true worth. The helicopter's rotors cut through humid air as Zara pressed her face to the window, watching the endless green canopy of the Amazon unfold below. 3 weeks into her assignment, She had begun to understand why the indigenous peoples called this place the lungs of the world. Every breath here felt deeper, richer, alive with possibilities that the sterile environments of space stations could never provide. Dr. Marcus Chen, the project's human lead, had been nothing but professional during their initial briefings. Unlike the subtle aversions she had grown accustomed to, he met her gaze directly, asked thoughtful questions about her research experience, and seemed genuinely interested in her expertise with bioluminescent organisms. When her scales had shifted to their defensive silver blue during their first meeting, he had simply commented, "Remarkable. Do the color changes correspond to specific environmental factors or emotional states?" The question had caught her off guard. No one had ever asked about the science behind her difference, only whether it could be corrected. Now, as their research camp came into view, a collection of sustainable structures nestled beside a tributary of the mighty river, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation instead of dread. Here, surrounded by 10,000 species that existed in perfect chaotic harmony, her own uniqueness felt less like a burden and more like a natural part of the world's infinite variety. Marcus greeted them at the landing pad, his khaki-filled clothes damp with honest sweat, his dark hair tousled by the humid air. "Dr. Zara," he said, extending his hand without hesitation, "welcome to paradise." His palm was warm against her scaled skin, and he didn't flinch at the texture that had caused others to recoil. Instead, he held the handshake for a moment longer than necessary, his brown eyes studying her face with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "The bioluminescent fungi we've been tracking are most active at night," he explained as he led her toward the main research facility. "Your expertise with light-producing organisms could be exactly what we need to understand their communication patterns." Over the following days, Zara found herself working alongside Marcus in ways that felt natural, unforced. He listened when she spoke, built upon her ideas rather than dismissing them, and showed her wonders of the rainforest with the enthusiasm of someone sharing treasures with a friend. When they discovered a new species of glowing lichen, he immediately deferred to her expertise, watching with fascination as her own bioluminescence responded to the organism's light patterns. "It's like you're communicating with them," he observed. One evening, as they catalogued specimens by lamplight, around them the forest symphony of night sounds created a backdrop of life in all its chaotic beauty. Zara's scales shifted to a warm golden hue, a color she hadn't displayed in years, one that indicated comfort and contentment. "In a way, I suppose I am. Light is a universal language." Marcus looked up from his field notes, and for a moment their eyes met across the small table. Something passed between them, not the clinical assessment she was used to, but a recognition that felt like the first warm day after a long winter. "You know," he said quietly, "I've spent my career studying adaptation and survival. The most successful species aren't the ones that conform to a single standard. They're the ones that develop unique traits that allow them to thrive in specific environments." Zara's heart skipped a beat. He was talking about biology, but something in his tone suggested deeper meaning. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus continued, "The Amazon has taught me that diversity isn't just beautiful, it's essential. Without variation, ecosystems collapse. Without difference, there's no evolution, no growth, no future." That night, as Zara lay in her hammock listening to the river's gentle flow, she touched her face where her scales caught the moonlight filtering through the canopy. For the first time in her adult life, she wondered if her differences might be seen not as flaws to overcome, but as gifts to be celebrated. The discovery happened on their 4th week in the Amazon, during what should have been a routine survey of nocturnal bioluminescent activity. Zara had been tracking fungal networks through the forest floor when her own patterns began responding to signals she couldn't consciously detect. Her scales rippled with complex sequences of light, blues cascading into greens, punctuated by brilliant flashes of silver. "Zara," Marcus whispered from beside her, his voice filled with wonder. "Look!" All around them the forest had come alive with answering lights. Fungi, insects, and even some previously unknown organisms pulsed in synchronization with her bioluminescence, creating a network of communication that spanned acres of rainforest. It was as if she had unconsciously tapped into a conversation that had been occurring for millennia. "I've never seen anything like this," she breathed, watching as her emotional patterns translated into something the forest's creatures understood and responded to. "My scales. They're not just decorative. They're part of a communication system." Marcus activated his recording equipment, but his eyes never left her. "You're not just observing the ecosystem," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that made her chest tighten. "You're part of it. This is extraordinary, Zara. You're extraordinary." The word hung between them in the humid night air. Extraordinary, not aberrant, not incompatible, not outside acceptable parameters. Extraordinary. As they documented the phenomenon, over the following nights, their professional partnership began shifting into something deeper. Marcus would find reasons to work closer to her, their shoulders brushing as they hunched over data tablets. When she grew excited about a discovery, her scales flashing bright gold, he would smile with a warmth that seemed to kindle its own light in his dark eyes. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said one evening, as they sat by the river, analyzing the day's samples. Zara's patterns immediately shifted to defensive silver, an involuntary response to years of painful personal questions. "I suppose the rejections you mentioned in your file, the compatibility assessments, were they because of your bioluminescence?" She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. 17 different agencies, councils, and compatibility services all came to the same conclusion. "I'm too different for successful pairing. My appearance causes psychological discomfort in potential partners. My children would likely inherit the same defects." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the riverbank. When he spoke, his voice carried an anger she hadn't expected. "Those systems are broken," he said firmly. "They're reducing the incredible complexity of attraction and compatibility to a checklist of physical conformity. They're missing the point entirely." "What point?" Zara asked, finally looking at him. "That love isn't about finding someone who looks like everyone else. It's about finding someone who complements you, who sees beauty where others see difference, who makes you feel like the best version of yourself." His hand moved closer to hers on the wooden dock where they sat. "It's about recognizing something, rare and precious when you find it." Zara's scales began to shift, cycling through colors she had never displayed before, deep purples mixed with gold, patterns that seemed to dance across her skin in the moonlight. Marcus watched the display with undisguised fascination. "What do those colors mean?" he asked softly. I don't know," she admitted. "I've never felt whatever emotion creates them before." His fingers brushed against the back of her hand, and she didn't pull away. The touch sent new patterns racing across her scales, silver streaked with rose, constellations of tiny lights that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've never had reason to feel it before." The forest around them pulsed with sympathetic light, as if the entire ecosystem was witnessing and celebrating this moment of connection. For the first time in her life, Zara's difference didn't feel like a barrier between her and love. It felt like a bridge toward something more beautiful than any standardized compatibility chart could ever measure. As they sat together in the bioluminescent cathedral of the Amazon night, Zara began to understand that she hadn't been looking for acceptance in the wrong places. She had been looking for it from the wrong perspective. She didn't need someone to overlook her differences. She needed someone who could see them as the magnificent adaptations they truly were. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, crackling through their satellite communication system with the harsh efficiency that Zara remembered too well. The Galactic Compatibility Council had somehow tracked her to the Amazon research station. They were requesting her immediate return for additional assessment procedures based on new compatibility algorithms. Zara stared at the transmission display, her scales flickering between silver anxiety and the deeper blue of despair. After 2 months in the Amazon, she had almost forgotten the world beyond the green cathedral, where her differences were celebrated rather than catalogued as defects. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, sitting on the dock where they had shared so many evening conversations. Her scales had settled into the muted grey pattern she displayed when trying to make herself invisible, a defense mechanism she thought she had abandoned. "The council wants me back," she said without looking up from the water. "They've developed new assessment criteria. Apparently, my work here has raised questions about previous evaluations." Marcus sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "And you're going to go?" "I have to. My research visa depends on maintaining good standing with the compatibility systems. If I don't comply, I could lose my work authorization across all human territories." "Zara, look at me." She turned to face him, and the expression in his eyes made her scales shimmer with those unnamed colors again, the ones that only appeared when he was near. "What if you didn't have to face them alone this time?" Before she could ask what he meant, Marcus was standing, pulling out his own communication device. His fingers moved quickly across the interface as he composed a message. "Marcus, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done weeks ago." He finished typing and showed her the screen. It was a formal communication to the Galactic Compatibility Council, but the subject line made her breath catch. "Request for joint assessment. Dr. Marcus Chen and Dr. Zara Veltar." "You can't," she whispered. "The social implications alone. A human requesting compatibility assessment with a genetically variant alien? Your career, your standing in the scientific community, will survive just fine," he interrupted, sitting back down and taking her hands in his. The touch sent cascades of gold and rose across her scales. "Zara, these past 2 months have been the most meaningful of my professional and personal life, not despite your differences, but because of them." Her bioluminescence pulsed faster, patterns she couldn't control racing across her skin like visible emotions. "When I watch you communicate with the forest's light networks, when I see how your unique biology allows you to understand things that no one else can perceive, when I observe the way your compassion extends to every living thing you encounter, I don't see genetic variance. I see evolution in action. I see the future." Tears gathered in her eyes, causing her scales to shift into patterns of deep purple, streaked with silver, colors that somehow expressed the overwhelming mixture of hope and fear coursing through her. "But what if they reject us too? What if the compatibility algorithms still classify me as unsuitable?" Marcus stood and extended his hand to her, the same gesture he had made when welcoming her to the research station months ago. But this time, the meaning was entirely different. "Then we'll know that their systems are measuring the wrong things," he said. "We'll know that they're trying to quantify something that can't be reduced to data points and parameters." Zara looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. In his eyes, she saw none of the clinical assessment she had grown accustomed to, none of the barely concealed discomfort that had met her in 17 previous evaluations. Instead, she saw recognition, acceptance, and something deeper that made her scales glow with warmth she had never believed possible. "Zara," he said softly, "in every system that matters, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, we're not just compatible, we're extraordinary together." She placed her hand in his, watching as her bioluminescent patterns responded to his touch with colors that had no names in any language she knew. Around them, the forest pulsed with sympathetic light, as if nature itself was acknowledging the rightness of their connection. For the first time in her life, Zara wasn't afraid of an assessment. She wasn't preparing for rejection or steeling herself against judgment. She was ready to demonstrate that true compatibility couldn't be measured by conformity to predetermined standards. It could only be recognized by its fruits. Together, they would return to face the council. Together, they would prove that love was not about finding someone who fit existing categories, but about creating new ones. The Compatibility Council chambers on Luna Station were exactly as Zara remembered. Sterile white walls, harsh lighting, and a panel of 12 assessors representing different species and computational systems. But this time, she wasn't alone. Marcus sat beside her, his hand resting confidently on the table between them, fingers intertwined with hers. The lead assessor, a crystalline being from the Vega system, reviewed their files with mechanical precision. "Dr. Veltar, your previous 17 assessments showed consistent incompatibility across all measured parameters. Dr. Chen, your request for joint evaluation with a genetically variant subject is unprecedented." "Unprecedented," Marcus replied, calmly, but not unfounded. He activated the holographic display they had prepared, showing months of research data from the Amazon. The room filled with images of bioluminescent networks, communication patterns, and breakthrough discoveries that had only been possible through Zara's unique abilities. Traditional compatibility assessments measure surface-level characteristics and statistical probabilities, Marcus continued, but they fail to account for the exponential potential that emerges when two individuals complement each other's unique strengths. The Andromedan assessor leaned forward. "Dr. Chen, are you prepared to accept the social and professional implications of pairing with a subject outside established norms?" Before Marcus could answer, Zara's scales began to shift. But instead of the defensive silver the Council had witnessed during her previous assessments, they pulsed with the deep gold and rose patterns that had become her signature response to Marcus's presence. "I need to say something," Zara said, her voice steadier than she had ever felt it in these chambers. "For 17 assessments, I've sat in rooms like this, allowing others to determine my worth based on how well I fit into predetermined categories. I've accepted that my differences made me unsuitable, incompatible, unwanted." Her bioluminescence intensified, patterns dancing across her skin with increasing complexity. "But I've learned something in the past months. Compatibility isn't about similarity. It's about harmony. It's about finding someone who doesn't just accept your differences, but celebrates them. Someone who sees your unique traits not as defects to overcome, but as gifts that make the partnership stronger." She turned to look at Marcus, and her scales erupted in colors the Council had never documented, spirals of gold and purple, constellations of tiny lights that seemed to map the depth of her emotions. "Dr. Chen doesn't love me despite my genetic variance. He loves me because of the totality of who I am, which includes every trait that previous assessments labeled as incompatible. And in return, I love him not because he fits some acceptable standard, but because his acceptance has allowed me to become the fullest version of myself." The room fell silent, except for the soft humming of the station's life support systems. The 12 assessors exchanged glances, their various communication methods creating a subtle symphony of decision-making. Then Marcus did something that would be discussed in compatibility assessment literature for decades to come. He stood up, moved to Zara's side of the table, and knelt beside her chair. Taking both of her hands in his, he looked directly at the council. 17 times you've told this remarkable woman that she doesn't fit your parameters for partnership, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber with absolute certainty. But I'm not here to ask for your approval of our compatibility. I'm here to inform you that your systems are obsolete. He turned to Zara, and in front of the council, the recording devices and the representatives of 12 different species, he said the words that would redefine everything she thought she knew about herself. Zara Veltar, you are not incompatible. You are not defective. You are not outside acceptable parameters. You are rare, you are precious, and you are mine, if you'll have me. Her scales exploded with light, every color she had ever displayed, and several that had never been recorded, patterns that spoke of joy so profound it became its own language. The bioluminescence was so intense that several assessors had to adjust their visual senses. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, as Marcus slipped a simple silver ring onto her finger, a ring that immediately began reflecting and amplifying. Her bioluminescent patterns, the lead assessor made a notation that would change compatibility assessment protocols forever. Classification. Transcendent compatibility. Subjects demonstrate exponential enhancement of individual capabilities through partnership, recommend immediate approval and inclusion in advanced pairing studies. But Zara barely heard the words. She was looking at Marcus, at the man who had seen her not as a collection of variants to be catalogued, but as a complete being to be loved. Her scales pulsed with colors that had no names because they represented emotions that had never existed before. The joy of being fully known and completely accepted. For the first time in her life, she understood that she had never been looking for someone to overlook her differences. She had been waiting for someone brave enough to celebrate them, wise enough to recognize their value, and loving enough to choose her not despite who she was, but because of who she was. In that sterile chamber on Luna Station, surrounded by assessors and algorithms, two beings from different worlds created their own definition of compatibility, one based not on conformity, but on the courage to love without limits.